and welcome to We Are Not a Stereotype, breaking down Asian Pacific American bias. Thank you for being here with us for this inaugural series of talks created for educators by educators. My name is Andrea Kim Neighbors, and I'm the Manager of Education Initiatives at the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center in Washington, D.C. We could not have made this talk and series possible without our brilliant speakers and educators, Liz Kleinrock and Dr. Kiona, who you'll be hearing from shortly. We're grateful and deeply humbled by their generosity and enthusiasm to create this inaugural series with us. Liz and Dr. Kiona, thank you. As Liz and Dr. Kiona are in different parts of the country, we want to begin this talk acknowledging the people and lands our speakers are currently on. We acknowledge the Piscataway people as the original stewards of the area commonly known as Washington, D.C., where the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center's office is located. We acknowledge the Comanche and Tonkawa people as the original stewards of the area commonly known as Austin, Texas, the land that Dr. Kiona is on. We acknowledge the Tongva people as the original stewards of the area commonly known as Los Angeles, California, the land Liz is on. We also want to take a moment to recognize those nations who are not acknowledged, yet occupy or have occupied the lands we teach on. I would now like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, since the series would not be possible without their support. This project received federal support from the Asian Pacific American Initiatives Pool, as well as support from Expedia. We would like to thank them for sponsoring this series and for making this learning opportunity available online for educators across the country. I'm now pleased to introduce Liz Kleinrock, an anti-bias, anti-racist educator and consultant, and Dr. Kiona, an educator, academic, and podcast host, for their talk breaking down AsianBlack Solidarity movements for liberation.
Well, thank you so much for having us. Liz and I will introduce ourselves before we get into our talk on AsianBlack Solidarity movements for liberation.
Yeah. So thank you all so much for spending your time with us today. My name is Liz Kleinrock. My pronouns are she, her. I am a Korean-born transracial adoptee, and I grew up in Washington, D.C. and currently live in Los Angeles. I've been working in education for a little over a decade and spent 10 years teaching in the classroom. I consider myself an anti-bias, anti-racist educator in progress, and I work with youth, school faculty, and parents and caregivers. I'm also a TED speaker, upcoming author, and work with Teaching Tolerance as a 2018 award winner and a member of their advisory board. I utilize social media through the Instagram account Teach and Transform to teach folks how accessible anti-bias and anti-racism can be and create access points for people of all identities to engage. Despite attending acclaimed schools throughout my life, I never saw myself represented in any aspects of the classroom, including the identity of my teachers and the curriculum. It took until adulthood and years of self-education to learn about my ancestors, history, and fully understand my identity. And I care deeply about this work because I want students to grow up seeing themselves represented in ways that highlight Asian American culture, joy, and power, rather than being erased or viewed from a deficit lens.
I'm Dr. Kiona. My pronouns are she, her, and I was born and raised on the island of Hawaii. I'm mixed race, Korean and Austrian, and I'm the founder of the award-winning digital educational platform, How Not to Travel Like a Basic Bee, which was launched in 2016. As someone who has worked in academia for 12 years and done research for 6, I saw the deficits in academia, where rarely brown and black people were deemed experts in their own cultures, and access to higher education is placed behind a giant paywall. So I created this public platform that does the opposite. I basically just travel all around the world, spotlighting different cultures, redefining the expert, and uplifting marginalized voices by hosting and teaching publicly streamed lessons for free on a gift-based financial model. This makes global education accessible to anyone with a smartphone. I also started an educational initiative where I take educational classes into the real world, and I do a monthly independent study abroad program to Cuba. I also run a mentorship program called How Not to Grad School Like a Basic Bee, which facilitates people of color getting into grad school on fully funded programs. This work is important to me because Asian history, voices, and representation have been intentionally erased and silenced, and advocating for Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in the media and education is necessary as a member of that community.
All right, so we have a number of objectives, for our session today. First, making sure we document the solidarity between Asian American and Black American liberation movements.
We also acknowledge that the main narrative is anti-Blackness in the Asian communities, and we seek to dispel this hurtful narrative that upholds the model minority myth, which will be covered in the next seminar.
We also aim to fill in the gaps of our own understanding in ways that we use history to shape our future.
And we also want to acknowledge that multiple books have been written about each of these slides. We will be presenting a condensed version, and it will not be all-encompassing, but we have a limited amount of time, so we'll cover as much as we can. So, ironically, the relationship between Asian Americans and Black Americans start at the crossroads of liberation. As one was said to be freed from labor, the other came to replace their positions. And truly, neither of them were free and haven't been free since. However, Asian American history isn't complete without Asian history, so let's head to China. During the Opium Wars, the British attempted to colonize China, leaving China economically devastated. In the Canton region specifically, farmers were really poor, and that's where human trade began. The Chinese were brought to the Americas by Europeans as coolies to replace enslaved Black Americans. An interesting fact, this is why generational Chinese Americans speak Cantonese and cannot understand new Chinese immigrants who speak Mandarin due to standardizing of language in China in the 20th century. Similar to Black Americans, Chinese Americans face discrimination at every level of society. Chinese Americans were not paid fair wages. Their bodies used as disposable labor. They paid race-based taxes, were made to cut their hair and separate from their culture. They were segregated from society. They didn't have any laws to protect them, and in fact, laws were used against them, and were at the receiving end of race-based murder, lynching, and hate crime. Black Americans, despite achieving freedom from chattel slavery, were under the same systems used to oppress them in the first place and experienced discrimination at every level of society, all of which still happens today. And this is where our liberation movements begin.
And so before we even get back to the United States, we're going to stay in Asia a bit longer. And we are going to move to the presence and the role of Black Buffalo soldiers in the Philippines. So following the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Spanish-American War in December of 1898, the United States took control of the former Spanish colonies of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Companies from the segregated Black infantry regiments were shipped out in 1899. And within the Black community in the United States, there was considerable opposition to intervention in the Philippines. Many Black newspapers and leaders supported the idea of Filipino independence and felt it was wrong for the United States to use Black folks to enforce their rule abroad. Prominent Black activists such as Ida B. Wells spoke out against Black soldiers being used to fight for the US while they were facing racial oppression and violence at home. Black soldiers quickly saw that the racism faced by Filipinos was similar to the treatment of Black folks in the United States, and many refused to be used in this way during the war. During the war in the Philippines, 15 US soldiers, 6 of them Black, ended up defecting. One of those Black soldiers, Private David Fagan, was eventually promoted to captain. But due to his refusal to participate in this war and further colonization, a bounty was placed on his head and he was allegedly murdered, though this has not been proven. Later, the Black regiments would be honored for their service in the Philippines. And so with that, we are going to move back into the United States and focus on the fight for school desegregation. And so since the focus of this webinar is to highlight and amplify the history of Asian and Black solidarity, we also have to look at how both Asian American and Black Americans were impacted by racist policies and societal beliefs. This is not to say that Asian Americans have experienced the same racial struggles as Black Americans throughout US history at all. However, that racial oppression rooted in white supremacy does manifest itself in different yet similar ways. The Asian and Black struggle is more intertwined than we were ever taught. And while the model minority myth presents an image that Asians have proximity to whiteness and Asians are not white, they have not been considered white in the United States. So while Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 is by far the most famous school segregation Supreme Court case, one of the earliest school segregation cases actually took place in 1927 and involved a Chinese American family in Mississippi. Zhu Gonglam and his wife, Catherine Wong, were both Chinese immigrants who settled in the US South. Both took up Southern American culture, went to church, and spoke and wrote fluently in English. Their children attended white schools early on, but when the family moved to Rosedale Consolidated School, their 9-year-old daughter, Martha, was told on her first day by the superintendent, acting on an order issued by the Board of Trustees, that she would not be allowed to return to the school because, quote unquote, she was of Chinese descent and not a member of the white or Caucasian race. They were told to leave and attend the Black school in town instead. And soon after, Martha's father filed a lawsuit. A Mississippi state court ruled in favor of Gong Lum, directing officials to readmit his daughter. It held that Martha should not have been classified as, quote unquote, colored. The Supreme Court of Mississippi, however, reversed the decision, citing the state constitution, which called for separate schools for white and colored students. Furthermore, the court held that Martha was of the Mongolian or yellow race and could not be considered white. The court also cited cases such as Plessy v. Ferguson, which upheld the idea of separate but equal education. This loss in the Supreme Court of Mississippi hurt both the Asian and Black communities in the United States. The unanimous ruling allowed for Mississippi schools to regulate themselves and racially classify students as they saw fit, giving schools more power to discriminate based on race. We thought this was a powerful and important example of how preliminary court cases build upon each other to where we finally reach Brown v. Board 30 years later. However, in mainstream historical narratives, we typically only hear about the winning cases, but we have to acknowledge the people who laid that foundation before. That brings us to the emergence of Afro-Asian solidarity. So while there's now increased visibility of the influence of the Black Power movement on the Asian American Yellow Power movement of the 60s and 70s, it's lesser known that prominent Black nationalists such as Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, Hubert Harrison, Marcus Garvey were familiar with and inspired by Asian political movements. In 1905, Du Bois wrote that the yellow peril and the color line were intertwined, and credited the Japanese with breaking the quote-unquote foolish modern magic of the word white and traveled to Japan, China, and Manchuria in the 1930s. However, before going further, we have to recognize the complications of Afro-Asian solidarity that center pro-Tokyo sentiments. Black nationalists saw that white supremacy was the shared enemy of Black Americans and the Japanese people, and he saw Japan's stance as a rejection of white supremacy and colonization. However, he did endorse Japan's presence as a colonizer within the Asian continent, supported Japan's invasion of China, and overlooked the mass violence executed by Japanese forces throughout other Asian countries. So while those who come from these Asian countries colonized by Japan will definitely disagree with Du Bois' opinions due to his dismissive attitude toward the oppression of other Asian nations, we can still recognize the influence of Asian political movements from leaders such as Mao Zedong and Ho Chi Minh on the Pan-Asian, Pan-African movements and what would later become the Black Power movement in the United States.
Okay, so let's head to the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party is one of the most recognizable revolution organizations in the United States. I don't know anybody who doesn't know the Black Panther Party. And this party contributed to so many accomplishments, not only for the Black community, but other marginalized groups. The Black Panther Party was co-founded by Huey P. Newton, which you'll see in the photos, and Bobby Seale in 1966. However, a lesser known fact is that Mao Zedong, the founding father of the People's Republic of China and one of the leaders in China's revolution, wrote a book called, quote, Quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong, or otherwise known as the Little Red Book. This Little Red Book was studied by the Black Panther Party as a manifesto for the Black Panther Party's ideas on socialism. The Black Panthers would go on to sell the book on the street, and the selling of the book would be used as fundraisers to raise funds for the organization. And you can see them holding the book on the upper right picture. The Black Panther Party carried out social programs in poor communities, including free health clinics, ambulance services, legal counsel, and prison busing. And this was inspired by Mao's call to serve the people. By the end of 1969, the Black Panther Party was serving free breakfast daily to 20,000 children in 19 cities. This would go on to inspire the school breakfast program, where the United States federal government provides free or reduced breakfast to eligible children today, many of whom are Black and Asian. Chairman Mao of China also made direct appeals to African Americans. When Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, he said in a speech, quote, "On behalf of the Chinese people, I hereby express resolute support for the just struggle of the Black people in the United States." On the left-hand and bottom right photo, you'll see Huey P. Newton on his trip to China. In 1970, the People's Republic of China invited the Black Panther to visit. At every Chinese airport he landed in, Newton was greeted by thousands of people waving copies of the Little Red Book and displaying signs that said, "We support the Black Panther Party, down with US imperialism." Unlike Marx and Lenin, Black revolutionaries saw the Chinese socialist models in a colored view, outside of the white Western version of class struggle. So through Chinese solidarity with the Black Panther Party, Asian and Black liberation movements were united on a global level, which takes us to yellow power.
Leading up to the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s, Asian Americans were grappling with the aftermath of the internment of over 120,000 Japanese American citizens during World War II, as well as the US presence in Vietnam. During these decades, activists fought for the development of an ethnic studies program in universities, which Dr. Kiona will speak about in a moment, an end to the Vietnam War, and reparations for Japanese Americans forced into these concentration camps during World War II. Asian Americans on college campuses demanded that curriculum represent their own histories, and Asian American activists sought to prevent gentrification from destroying Asian American neighborhoods. In Amy Uematsu's famous 1969 essay, The Emergence of Yellow Power, she wrote, "Yellow power is just now at the stage of an articulated mood rather than a program. Disillusionment and alienation from white America and independence, race pride, and self-respect." In 1968, a group of UC Berkeley students formed a coalition and coined the term Asian American. The Asian American Political Alliance was founded to protest the Vietnam War, advocate for Asian American self-determination, and was heavily influenced by the Black Panthers. And here it's also important to note the interracial intersections of these movements and the influence of the Black Panther Party on other groups such as the American Indian movement and the Chicano Brown Berets.
Which brings us to the greatest showcase of solidarity across all people of color. The Third World Liberation Front and Black Student Union go on a strike for diversity in education. And these strikes representation in education was a huge solidarity movement. These two separate yet related strikes took place in California. The first student strike was at San Francisco State College and is deemed the longest student strike in America. The second student strike was at the University of California, Berkeley, and these strikes were in response to the Eurocentric education and lack of diversity that honestly still exists today. It began as a sit-in to protest the releasing of student information for the potential to be drafted into the war, but ended in the suspension and firing of educators of color. This led to the formation of the Third World Liberation Front, a coalition of ethnic student groups. Following the suspension and arrest of several Black students who attacked a school newspaper editor after he called for the defunding of Black student programs and classes, the Black Student Union made demands specific to the Black community. The Third World Liberation Front, consisting of the Chinese for Social Action, the Filipino American Collegiate Endeavor, the Asian American Political Alliance, as well as the Latin American Student Organization, the Mexican American Student Confederation, La Raza, and the Native American Students Union all made additional demands in support of the Black Student Union. So you can see everybody came together for this movement. These specific demands for change included hiring of minority faculty members, recruiting students from the ghetto, their words, not mine, and ending the Air Force ROTC program on campus. Their protests were peaceful, lasting 5 months. However, they turned violent as they were met with police brutality, resulting in many students injured. The strikes ended after a 15% drop in attendance and following a hunger strike when the universities agreed to meet their demands, resulting in the creation of ethnic studies in universities today. So any class that you take that is not Eurocentric and is ethnic-centered is because of this movement. This progression in the academic system was a direct result of Asian and Black solidarity movements amongst all other solidarity movements, including Chicanos, Latinos, and Native Americans. Which then takes us to the Vietnam War. So the Vietnam War, or otherwise known as the Resistance War against America in Vietnam, was opposed by the majority of America. Actually, only a third of America supported this war. Anti-war movements opposed America's occupation of Southeast Asia and the inhumane war tactics used on Asians abroad. This particularly hit the Black community because they were being disproportionately drafted compared to whites. In 1967, 64% of all eligible African Americans were drafted, but only 31% of eligible whites. And from 1965 to 66, the casualty rate for Black Americans were twice that of white Americans. This resulted in a strong opposition first denounced by Malcolm X. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a committee of Black youth, produced a statement declaring that Blacks should not, quote, fight in Vietnam for the white man's freedom until all the Negro people are free in Mississippi, unquote. Dr. Martin Luther King followed Malcolm X, and took a strong public stand against it. He stated in a 1966 speech that Black leaders could not become blind to the rest of the world's issues while engaged solely in problems of domestic race tensions. He quotes, "It would be very inconsistent for me to teach and preach nonviolence in this situation and then applaud violence when thousands of people, both adults and children, are being maimed and mutilated and many killed." 2 weeks later, he organized a rally of 125,000 people protesting against the war, as you see in the middle picture. The picture on the left is a famous quote by the Black boxer Muhammad Ali, who was convicted for refusing to report to the US military forces during the Vietnam War and appealed his conviction, suing the United States in Clay versus United States in 1971. The Black Panthers are also seen withdrawing support for the war on the right-hand picture. Black people had a disproportionate stake in the Vietnam War and strongly opposed it in a form of solidarity against the murdering of Asian people overseas. Which brings us to us fighting for each other in our next slide. So throughout time, it's been seen that racial groups see liberation at different times. When it comes to citizen rights, landowning rights, voting rights, not all racial groups achieve steps to freedom and equality at the same time. And that is due to efforts being made by one racial group without solidarity from or for other groups. However, there are specific instances in history where there are activists from other racial groups for the liberation of racial groups outside of their own. And here we will highlight 4. Not many people know about the 3 Japanese Black Panthers that were recruited and assimilated into the ranks of the Black Panther Party, specifically for the liberation of Black people. Their names are Mike Tagawa, Richard Aoki, and Guy Kuros. All of them were either born or held in the Japanese concentration camps and had been exposed to social justice and activism through that experience and knew the importance of racial equality. Another Japanese concentration camp survivor is Yuri Kochiyama, who was heavily influenced by Malcolm X. While Malcolm X was a revolutionary Black nationalist, specifically for the rights of and freedom of Black people, Yuri was for integration and the liberation of all peoples. She advocated for the reparations of Japanese people held in the camps, won, and used the victory to advocate for reparations for African Americans. She supported Puerto Rican independence, Black separatism, anti-war movements, and rights for imprisoned people. Next is Dr. Grace Lee Boggs, who was a prominent figure of the Detroit Black Power movement, where she spent her life advocating for civil rights and labor rights. She advocated so hard that when the FBI tapped her phone, they thought that she was Afro-Chinese when she was really just Chinese-American. She worked alongside Black American James Boggs, who was her husband, and they went on to open many multicultural centers and schools. And finally, Dr. Angela Davis is an African-American living activist and feminist that has spent her life and continues to fight for freedom. She is an abolitionist advocating against the prison complex and describes it as a new form of slavery in the criminal justice system. Her activism has landed her in prison and on the FBI's most wanted list. However, she currently lectures at universities and gives speeches all around the world calling for critical thinking. I mean, talk about resistance. She has been a strong advocate for solidarity movements, specifically advocating for the end of apartheid in Palestine, where she described Ferguson and Palestine as the same movement. And as you can see, these Asian and Black activists dedicated their lives not only to the fighting of their own rights and liberties, but for the intentional liberation of others. Which brings us to today.
Thank you. So to end, we're going to discuss the Black Lives Matter movement and also Asians for Black Lives. So Kiona's last slide left us in the 60s and 70s in the United States, but we also have to recognize that there has been a history of so much solidarity in the time between the 60s and now. However, as she stated before, this lack of visibility of solidarity is intentional. And we also have to acknowledge that when people of color are pitted against each other, white supremacy comes out the winner in the end. So it's incredibly important that we highlight this history as well as the work that's being done today. Since the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement and before, Asian communities and organizations have stepped up to voice support and solidarity with the Black community. Particularly over the past few weeks, we've seen Asian organizations such as Asians for Black Lives, Act for Change, AAPI Women Lead, Japanese Americans for Justice, the Muslim Alliance for Sexual and Gender Diversity, amongst so many others, that have called in the Asian communities to address and dismantle anti-Blackness and support the Black community. In fact, a group of Asian students at Walter Payton College Preparatory High School in Chicago organized the Dear Asians initiative, creating a letter calling for Asian support of the Black Lives Matter movement that has now been translated into 11 different Asian languages. So while we also acknowledge and recognize that anti-Blackness as well as xenophobia are global issues and that neither community is immune to the oppression of the other, we must pay attention to the stories amplified in mainstream media, seek out sources that amplify other narratives, as we as individuals must counter those, because in the end, our liberation is intertwined.
So Asian and Black solidarity will and must continue. Racism is not an exclusive Asian American nor African American experience. Our struggles are not always the same, yet we operate under the same systems of oppression. We encourage everyone to look beyond their own struggles and outside of their own communities to find the similarities in each other and advocate for change. Change is rooted in global solidarity, and all of our collective liberation is tied to each other. So we as Asian American educators not only advocate for the progression and equality of Asian Americans, but strongly believe that Black lives matter.
And so, as you heard at the very beginning of our webinar, we covered a lot of information and we only really scratched the surface. These are some additional resources that we recommend where you can dive deeper into some of the topics that we covered, amongst others. And again, just thank you so much for having us, being able to use this platform to amplify our history and how, you know, our struggle, our freedom, our liberation is so deeply tied to that of the Black community. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Liz and Kiona, for this wonderful and incredibly powerful presentation. I want to first thank you, but also to share that if you enjoyed this talk and wish to learn more about the history embedded in this talk and surrounding this talk, please visit this website, smithsonianapa.org/learn/not a stereotype. Here, we're going to have digital collections through the Smithsonian's Learning Lab where you can interact with high-res images of objects and resources that are available to expand everything that you've heard from this talk. And also later this fall of 2020, a new activity book related to this series and everything else that you have heard just now. We will also be having a number of talks touching on a variety of topics and questions and themes. And so we hope that you visit this website throughout the summer of 2020 to learn more. I'd like to change our format to end screen sharing because I'd love to have a quick Q&A with our speakers. So if you pardon me as we switch. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for sharing this incredible presentation. I'm really struck by this very long history. I'm also struck by the fact that, frankly, for myself, I didn't learn much about this in school. And so my first question kind of touches on that very real situation. I hear from a lot of friends, family, colleagues, even interns who wish to come to the Asian Pacific American Center, who identify as Asian American, and they talk about how they never saw themselves in what they were learning in school. So in thinking about this presentation that you just provided, why is this history important to include in lessons or discussions about racial equity and social justice?
I think Malcolm X said it best, and I don't have a quote in front of me, but that if we don't know ourselves, our histories, there is no progression. If we have no idea what we have built on to get here, how can we possibly move on? And that's why it's so important for Asian Americans to know their history, but also be gentle with yourself that it was intentional that this was erased. Liz and I are doing independent studies outside. Obviously, like, we didn't learn this in school either. I actually did learn about it in university, but because I specifically sought it out. And I only learned about it because I minored in African American studies and took a class in Asian and African American liberation movement. So, but if I hadn't sought out that class, it wouldn't have been part of my consciousness either. And then also representation matters so much because the decentering of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in all aspects of society, including law, school, education, representation in the media, does something to the psyche of the Asian American and Pacific Islander, and that we consistently decenter, silence ourselves. They don't even have to do it for us anymore. We just won't speak up, or are afraid to speak up, or don't even have the vocabulary or know what that looks like. Even though we have so many amazing role models throughout history, when it's suppressed and silenced, how can we possibly build off of that? So as two women who do that every single day, we're constantly met with opposition and like, oh, you're just an anomaly. When like, no, we're like building on thousands of ancestors who have done the same work that we've done. It's just never been amplified. So that's why I feel like it's really, really important. I'm sure Liz has a good answer too.
So I feel like on like a personal level, like imposter syndrome is something that I've dealt with like my entire life. Not only as being Asian American, also being adopted an Asian American. And someone very wise to me recently said that we have to continue to push ourselves, because if we give into imposter syndrome, we give into this idea that we are a monolith. And, you know, if you don't fit into that very stereotypical package of what you think Asian or Asian American is, then you end up feeling like an outsider your entire life. If you look at data from like the Pew Research Center, that Asians, Asian immigrants, Asian Americans are the fastest growing people of the global majority within the United States. However, I believe that less than 2% of public school teachers and administrators also identify as Asian or Asian American. And so we have a growing Asian population with the United States, but still very little representation in school leadership, classroom facilitators, and therefore the people who are making the curriculum also are ignorant of our history and therefore can't include it. I know that since teaching in Los Angeles, I've taught 1st through 5th grades, that I have had Korean students come up to me and say, like, I've never had a teacher who looked like you, and how powerful that is. Or if I wish my Korean students like a happy Chuseok, they're just like, oh my gosh, like I've never had a teacher who even knew like what that was or like what that meant and how exciting that is. But also the very limited amount of Asian American history I ever learned in school was really just centered on the internment of Japanese Americans and Chinese Exclusion Act. And so what happens if the only history you ever learn is through a lens of oppression? Like, what does that do to you? What does that do to your identity? And also, what does that do for Asian American students, but also students who don't identify as Asian? What messages are they learning as well? As I said in my introduction, that I think we need to be able to highlight and amplify like the culture and the power of Asian Americans. Like, I wonder what I would have been like if I had grown up knowing that there were people like Lee Boggs, people like Yori Kuchiyama, people who look like me, who fought for things that I also believe in. What kind of an impact that would have made, I don't know, but I hope that my students never have to grow up with that same experience.
Mm-hmm. I had a conversation with someone recently where I said, if I had known about Grace Lee Boggs, if I had known about Yuri Kochiyama, and honestly, if I had known about Angela Davis when I was younger, I think I would have been a very different person today. It's, you know, that's it's a question that makes me pause, but also makes me want to dive in more to educate myself on what it is that I don't know and what more there is to learn. And I think, thank you both for that beautiful answer. And this actually leads to, it's actually a great segue to the second question is, as viewers listen to this talk that you just provided, and as they absorb this history, there might be questions and ideas formulating about taking action, what taking action looks like. So I'm wondering, what are some critical next steps you would advise our viewers take in and also take on?
That's a really good and complicated question. So I would consider what we're in right now to hopefully be the start of a revolution for a better world. And there's so many different parts and moving pieces in a revolution. And it's really important to know what your niche is, where you can create change, and know that you can't do it by yourself and not to get overwhelmed. And so for me, I've identified education is where I know that system and I know the weaknesses in that system, especially when it comes to racial equality for Black people as well as Asian Americans. And that is a system that I can seek to change. So identifying what I'm good at and then how I can change that, not only and on both sides. So on one side, I have a mentoring program where I'm trying to get more POCs to apply to graduate school, because that's always their excuse. Oh, well, POC don't apply. And I'm like, okay, well, what's going to happen when a bunch of POC spam your system and you're going to have a ton of applicants? What then? And so I'm also having, I'm on the call with my VP of diversity at my alma mater. I'm on a call with the dean. Tomorrow I have a call with the provost. And it's just constantly advocating for, okay, once I get you these applicants, are you going to accept them? And once you accept them, are you going to treat them fairly? Or are you going to be violent towards them like how I experienced throughout my academic career? What are you going to be transparent with your faculty? How many Black faculty are you hiring amongst any other POC? What are some steps that you're doing for anti-racism, anti-bias for your current lectures now? Are you doing, are you auditing your classes to make sure that they're not building information on racist studies that were done in the past? And who are you defining as an expert in certain cultures that we're studying? Those are all things I know that I am good at because I've been in those trenches for like over a decade. And so that's where my concentration lies, but that's not for everybody. But I would say your action step is to seek out what is the system that you're in that you can change, and what are the ways that you can change it.
Yeah, again, going back to that education piece is so incredibly important. I feel like a lot of the work that I've done as an adult has been the result of years of like therapy and imposter syndrome and self-loathing and the racial trauma, and feeling very alone and very isolated. And so I think what Dr. Kiona was talking about, the importance of coalitions, like not only learning about them in history, but identifying who are the people that you can build relationships with and work together going forward, because this is exhausting. It's really hard, if not impossible, to do any of this on your own. I think spending a lot of time self-reflecting, understanding who you are, the intersections of your identities, how you show up in certain spaces, learning about your own history. But you also have to recognize that consuming intellectual information will only get you so far too. You have to think about how you're spending that and how you're putting it forward. If that means interrupting racist comments or microaggressions that are coming from your family, your friends, your community, practicing that, making sure that you are recognizing the moments when it's your turn to step up, but also when it's your turn to also stay in your lane. And there's a lot of nuance involved in that too. And that only comes after, a lot of learning and a lot of practice as well. I know it feels really, really overwhelming for folks who are just getting started, but recognize you don't have to become like Yuri Kochiyama overnight. It's a lifelong process, but just recognizing that it takes a lot of time and a lot of intentionality going forward. And you're going to mess up, you're going to make mistakes, and to not give up when that happens.
I have a final question. I would like to know, this presentation that you just gave, what does this history mean to you personally?
It means everything. It means like, I don't know, people always would identify me as like, oh, you're just like, you're different. You're not like those other Asians. I'm like, what are you talking about? Because like, if you met my mom, she's like a more militant version of me. So I'm like, I don't understand what you're talking about. And also like all of the Asians and Pacific Islanders that I've been around are equally as woke or like militant. I wouldn't say like we're all perfectly woke, but like we all aren't the silent stereotype that has been fed to us over and over again. And so I'm like, I just don't get it. And then doing this presentation, delving into our own histories of all the Asians who weren't silent, all the Asians who were militant, all the Asians who didn't stand for white supremacy and like their own oppression as well as the oppression of others. I'm like, I see myself finally. Like, I'm not what they keep telling me I am, or I'm not an anomaly. Like, this has been we've been around for a long time, and that's something that I can feel confident in my own identity that yes, I'm just adding to it. Two, that this work has been done before me and will continue after me, so it's not new. And that gives me confidence to like moving forward that I'm not totally out of place, because sometimes society will make you feel that way.
Yep.
I mean, there's very little to add to what Kiona said. It's just powerful. It's the opportunity to reclaim an identity that's been written by somebody else for far too long, to dispel the model minority myth and know that we can show up loudly and unapologetically and take up space and feel good about doing that. It just means so much because, again, like when I think about like the students I've worked with, all I want is for them to grow up with more and better than what I had as a kid. And hopefully the series and people who are watching it will, have some takeaways that they can use with the people in their lives. And hopefully, it'll just spread out like a ripple effect.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a great note to end this on. Thank you both so much for this talk. I am thrilled that we have this space and that you helped to make this happen. Thank you for doing this talk. Thank you for helping shape this series. This is such an important conversation. And I look forward to having more with you and then with those who tune in and then with more speakers to come. So thank you so much.
And thank you for advocating for us.
Oh, absolutely.